If you had to lay odds on the likelihood of a major great power war, say in the next 20 years, what odds would you choose?
I don't think there's going to be a war. I wouldn't want to bet on such a thing because I don't want to lose that bet, or win it for that matter. I don't think there's going to be a major war for a number of reasons. First, because taking the Soviet leaders at their most aggressive worst, whatever that may be, they are not fools. They are not madmen. An Andropov is not a Hitler, just as Brezhnev was not and Khrushchev was not. So I think under the circumstances, we're going to find that they have some incentive to avoid war. They want to conquer the world. They want communism to dominate the world, but not a world of destroyed cities and of dead bodies. So they want to win without war. That is what they're trying to do, and that is the great danger that we confront. Now, having said that I do not believe there will be a war, there are two conditions. One, that the United States continue to develop the military strength across the board that will deter Soviet military action. And second, and this is even more critical, in the peripheral areas, I'm referring to the Mideast, to Latin America, to Southeast Asia, as distinguished from Europe, where I think there will not be a major Soviet offensive there. In those peripheral areas, to find ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union can negotiate about their differences there, having in mind the fact that we're never going to agree. All we can ever agree upon with the Soviet is how can we be adversaries without allowing our adversarial relationship escalate into war, and that is possible.
You say that Khrushchev and Brezhnev and Andropov are not crazed like Hitler was. Are they less evil than he was?
In the sense that certainly what we would call Hitler's mania with regard to the Holocaust that was visited upon the Jewish population, not only of Germany but the rest of Europe. You do not have that mania in the Soviet Union, although they are anti-Semitic. Most of the Russian leaders that I have met deep down are anti-Semitic. As far as repression is concerned, I do not think that the Soviet Union has been any less repressive than Hitler's Germany was. Millions have been killed by Stalin. In later years, however, not as much. So consequently, it's changed to that extent.
How would the Soviet leaders you've met and dealt with indicate or demonstrate their anti-Semitism?
Oh, just by a comment here and there, but not so much by what they did demonstrate, but by, why don't you repeat that question, because I don't think that makes the point. Make it again.
How did the Soviet leaders that you've met indicate or express or demonstrate their anti-Semitism?
Nothing in what they said, but really in what they did. In terms of their attitude toward Jewish immigration, they simply set up barriers which were almost impossible to overcome. And I would say that as far as the progress we made during the period of so-called détente, that there we'd had considerable success, but only because we convinced them that it was in their interest to lower the barriers which allowed Jews to emigrate so that they could accomplish progress on other fronts. I just used to make privately, and in every meeting I had with them in 72, 73, and 74, I would emphasize the point that their intransigence on Jewish immigration had a very detrimental effect on my ability to get support for progress in other areas that had to do with détente. And that had its effect, because when we came into office, for example, in 1969, the year before, only 600 Jews were allowed to emigrate. In 1973, it got up to 30,000. In 1974, of course, it went down again because the Congress passed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which openly conditioned Jewish emigration on Soviet conduct, and that was a mistake.
You were under tremendous domestic political pressure to raise that issue. Considered objectively, do you think that the issue of Jewish emigration was important enough to have used it to sort of pull in your détente chips on that issue?
I was interested in results. I wasn't interested in making a big political ploy out of the fact that I was hammering on the table in my meetings with Brezhnev and demanding that Jews be allowed to emigrate. I knew that doing that would have a counterproductive effect. And it has had a counterproductive effect. It did have whenever that kind of practice was followed. I knew the best way to get them to cooperate would be to do it privately, very, very firmly, but making it clear that it was in their interest because of their concern about progress on other issues to be more liberal insofar as immigration was concerned. I was never able to get that across to most of the people in the American Jewish community, unfortunately. I never got much credit for what we were able to accomplish because sometimes I'm afraid people would prefer to have the issue rather than progress in resolving the issue.
If it weren't for the domestic political pressure, would you have raised it? Would you have considered, with Brezhnev, would you have considered it objectively an important enough issue to have taken a lot of time and to have demanded or required or made it a condition for other concessions or other arrangements?
Let's make it very clear. I never made it a condition. I didn't believe it should be a condition. It was an internal matter within the Soviet Union. However, I did feel that under the circumstances it was important from a very personal standpoint, knowing the situation there, from a moral standpoint to make progress on it. And I thought it was in the interest of the Soviet Union itself to make progress on that issue.
Getting back to the 1960 election, you say that your ability to get along with Khrushchev really had nothing to do with your ability to lead the country or the two countries to war or peace. But that would have been a very potent political issue, the idea that Khrushchev had spread the word through his actions or through his words that he couldn't get along with you, that therefore you would be a risky leader. Was that used against you in the campaign? Was that an issue, or did the Kennedy forces spread that word? Mrs. Herter was on your side, but if it had reached that level, it must have reached the other side.
No, as a matter of fact, when Khrushchev told Kennedy that he in effect had supported Kennedy in the campaign and had voted for him and so forth and so on, I think he really meant what he had said, that he did favor Kennedy over me because he had taken my measure and he was convinced that while I might turn out to be reasonable, I would be very, very hard to push over. He would never have tried with me what he did to Kennedy at Vienna, you know, where when Kennedy met with him in their first, and as a matter of fact, their only summit, he would never have been able to do that with me. But be that as it may, I do not think it had a detrimental effect as far as that very close campaign in 1960 was concerned. It might have had the contrary effect, because when Kennedy raised the issue that the United States, that President Eisenhower ought to consider apologizing to Khrushchev for the U-2 incident, I was able to nail him on that issue, and he had to back down from it. No, the American people in 1960 weren't that dovish. They wanted a strong president. As a matter of fact, ironically, Kennedy gained not from being more dovish than I did, but from appearing to be more hawkish on the issue of Cuba, because in our last debate, as some will recall, he advocated that the United States should support the forces of liberation inside and outside of Cuba. And I had to take the position, which was against what I really believed, that the United States shouldn't do that because I knew we were already doing it. It was a covert CIA operation which later ended up in the disaster of the Bay of Pigs because it wasn't carried out the way that Eisenhower laid it down. And I think that that very issue, any one of a number of issues could make a difference of the 12,000 votes shift that would have determined the different president in 1960, but that very issue certainly disconcerted some of my strong anti-communist supporters when they thought that I was softer on Castro than Kennedy, and it was just the other way around.
What happened when Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna?
I was, of course, not privy to the conversations, but I did read a report by James Reston on it, and Reston said that Khrushchev was brutal, belligerent, as he had been in this picture that we saw here, and that it shook Kennedy. Now, Reston was a supporter of President Kennedy, and I don't mean that Kennedy was frightened, but I do mean that it caused him considerable concern, and under the circumstances, he had to regain and recoup in some way. And that may have been one of the reasons why the Cuban confrontation became absolutely essential. He couldn't leave an impression after that meeting in Vienna that Khrushchev could bully him.
It's widely believed that Khrushchev took away the impression from that meeting that Kennedy was in fact not a strong leader, and that did lead him to probe and to test
to put the missiles
further.
into Cuba.
If you had been president in 1961, he would have had prior experience of you and would have known that you were not that way. Does it follow that there wouldn't have been a Cuban Missile Crisis? Does it also follow from what you've said that there would have been a Bay of Pigs, but it would have been successful because you would have carried it out as it was originally planned?
Well, of course, I'm not the best witness on that. Certainly the Bay of Pigs would have been carried out very differently. Once we committed the United States, we would certainly not have allowed that particular venture to fail, particularly when it's right next door. There was no excuse. It wasn't many, many miles away. It was right next door, and we had the capability within the area through air support and so forth to make that succeed. And once we had taken that step, and Eisenhower had that same view. He said he would never have approved an operation of that sort without air support. As far as the Cuban confrontation is concerned, my guess is that Khrushchev would have been quite unlikely to have tried to sneak missiles into Cuba if he felt that he had to deal with me. And incidentally, after that confrontation, Kennedy's hand was strengthened with Khrushchev. Let me say in that respect, too, when you look at the difference between Khrushchev and Brezhnev, my guess is that Brezhnev would not have put missiles into Cuba. Khrushchev was a greater gambler. He was more emotional. And more emotional and more of a risk taker than Brezhnev. Brezhnev was more cautious. That would be my guess, just in retrospect.
Why did Kennedy, who was not weak in terms of his perception of the communist threat and was a military man himself and was not averse to the application of force, why did he let the Bay of Pigs fail?
Bad advice. I think that if he had followed his own instincts, he would never have let it fail. But he caught a lot of hell from his more liberal advisors. They were divided on it, Adlai Stevenson and some of the rest. And so under the circumstances, Kennedy felt that, well, once it became known that it was an American-supported initiative, that we mustn't go too far. And that, of course, is a great, great mistake. I remember Churchill wrote in his volume on the First World War, multi-volume work on the First World War, he said that a commander in war can either follow a policy of audacity or one of caution, but he must not follow one that tries to be both. And in this case, the audacious policy was the only one that could succeed there. And by mixing it with the policy of restraint, it failed on both sides.
You had known Kennedy for numbers of years. Was it characteristic of him to vacillate and to be indecisive and to sort of mix conflicting advice and come out with a?
No, not characteristic at all.
Why did he do
I
it
think
then
it was.
on the
I think it
most
was
important issue?
It wasn't characteristic. It would have been characteristic, for example, of Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson basically was a Hamlet-like person. He always commiserated about and talked about all these decisions, difficult decisions he had to make and so forth. He was very thoughtful, but it was very hard for him to decide anything. Eisenhower was a decisive man. He made great decisions, not off the top of his head and not impetuously, but after consideration he decided something and it was done. Kennedy was also decisive, but Kennedy in those early years sat on what I would say a somewhat schizophrenic group of advisors. Some were hawkish, so to speak, those who supported, for example, what he said in his inaugural speech to the effect, we will fight any place, anywhere in defense of freedom and so forth. And when he went to Berlin, we are all Berliners and so forth and so on. Now these were very strong statements, in fact statements that put the United States on the line and perhaps in areas that we would not be able even to support. We didn't have the ability to do so, but they were made. On the other hand, he had advisors who felt that this was the time to have a more conciliatory attitude toward the Soviet Union. And Kennedy, in that early period, I think, ran into that problem. And President Johnson had the same problem. Some of Kennedy's more dovish advisors stayed on with Johnson, and Johnson, as a result, reaped the detriments of both worlds by failing to have a policy that was aggressive enough and strong enough to bring the war in Vietnam to a successful conclusion earlier.
Did you try to get to President Kennedy either with advice about how to deal with Khrushchev based on your experience, or to urge him to follow through on the Bay of Pigs plan as it had originally been conceived?
No, I saw him right after the Bay of Pigs, and he asked what would I recommend, and I said, well, I would go in now. I said I would find some reason to go in. For example, perhaps something that Castro is doing to our base there in Cuba or something of that sort, but find some reason to go in. But I said I would certainly try to find a way to go in now. And Kennedy said he had thought of that, but that some of his advisors had urged him not to do so because they thought that Khrushchev was in a very, very cocky mood at the moment, and that if we did something in Cuba, he might do something in Berlin. Now, the point about all that, where I think his advisors were wrong, is that Khrushchev was not a madman either. He was one that would take risks. He was bold. But on the other hand, he, at that time, knew that the United States had a preemptive first strike capability against the Soviet Union, despite all of his huffing and puffing about his missiles. We had at least a 15-to-1 advantage in the Kennedy years. And we were looking down their throat. He wouldn't about have gone into Berlin or any place else knowing that the United States could knock out his nuclear capability with a preemptive strike. And so I think that those that were frightened or fearful of what Khrushchev would do simply missed the mark. He was going to talk big, but when it came to action, he would never have called Kennedy's hand. Not in Berlin, and certainly not in Cuba.
There's a fascinating short film of you taken in the Oval Office with Kennedy when you went to visit him at the time of the Bay of Pigs. What kind of spirits did you find him in? Was he up, or was he depressed? Was he worried?
Well, he was worried, of course, I mean, as he is expectedly. He was, and of course, he was looking at some of the things that had gone wrong. And he was really taking off at his advisors, and I didn't blame him a bit. He thought that he'd gotten bad advice from the military, he'd gotten bad advice from the CIA and everybody else. But Allen Dulles, you know, when he saw me the day of the Bay of Pigs, in fact, the day before I saw Kennedy in the Oval Office, he took the responsibility and the blame, as any big man would. He said, I almost told the president. And I said, I will never forgive myself for not doing it. I almost told him that if he makes this decision to go in, it must not fail. But I didn't do so.
Do you believe that he didn't, in fact, tell him?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think he did not tell him. No, because there was no question. Allen Dulles was in a very emotional state at that time. I remember he came to the door. He was coming there to brief me because I was going to take a trip later abroad, and I asked him if he'd like a drink, and I said, I certainly need one. I didn't know at that time it had failed. And I said, well, what has happened? And they said, this is the blackest day in my life. The whole operation has failed. We have lost everything. He did make the point, too. He said, now, Kennedy was very courageous in overruling some of his dovish advisors and going in the first place. And then Allen Dulles took the responsibility. He says, I didn't tell him that it must not fail, and I should have.
How would things have been different if the Bay of Pigs invasion had succeeded?
Well, it's rather iffy to even speculate about such a question. Certainly, it would have meant that we wouldn't have the problems we have today in Central America. After all, it isn't what Castro has done to Cuba. It's the fact of what Castro has done outside of Cuba. Cuba is a Soviet base in the Americas. And so he's exporting his revolution and making trouble in Central America and other countries. And also, Castro is a willing proxy puppet of the Soviet Union. Why are Cuban troops in Angola? Why are they in Ethiopia? Why are they in other countries in Africa? Who's paying for it? The Russians. And if you didn't have Castro there, he is the best puppet the Soviet have got. If you didn't have him there, the world would be very different.
It's still hard to figure out why Kennedy, who was a strong and decisive man and who knew that his presidency, the early reputation of his presidency was on the line, allowed himself, after the thing began to clearly fail, to be pulled back and forth still by the schizophrenia of his advisors, especially when you consider that someone like Stevenson, according to a number of the memoirs and records of the time, he had great contempt for Stevenson's Hamlet-like qualities and had put him off in the UN so that he would be harmless there. Why did Kennedy have what appears to be a failure of will or decisiveness on this most crucial, vital, hemispheric issue?
Well, I can't say why, but I think that is the best explanation. I know that his failure to act there was not because he himself was not a decisive person. He's a strong, tough fellow. There's no question about that. He was tough in his campaigning. His war record would indicate that, certainly. And I don't think there's any question that if he had followed his own intuitions, it would have turned out very differently, but he didn't do so.
Did he pay attention to his presidency? Is it possible that this issue just sort of crept up on him, as a lot of people claim that he never really focused initially, again, was torn by his advisors on Vietnam, and it wasn't until what turned out to be shortly before his death, after the Diem coup, that he really began to focus on Vietnam, and a number of the Kennedy supporters say that he would have been very decisive in getting out of it. He would have, when he had focused on it, he would have seen that it was a bad thing and he would have got out. Is it arguable that he just wasn't concentrating on the Bay of Pigs until it was too late?
I suppose it's arguable, but
was that characteristic
I'm not
of him?
I wouldn't think it would be characteristic, and I would not go along with those who try to say that if Kennedy had only understood what Vietnam was all about, he wouldn't have gone in or wouldn't have got out, or he would have gotten out. He was a world thinker. I know that from knowing him long before he was president. He didn't think in small terms and parochial terms. He knew how important Vietnam was and that our failing there could have massive effects in other parts of the world. He knew that the war in Vietnam wasn't about Vietnam, but it was about Southeast Asia generally and about our relations with the rest of Asia. I just don't believe that those who are trying to say that he was misled and he was misled and thereby misled the country into supporting the Vietnamese government, sending the first 16,000 combat troops there. I don't go along with that at all.
Did Kennedy ever talk to you about Stevenson?
No. No.
One of the diplomatic hot potatoes that was thrown you at the end of the Eisenhower administration was meeting Castro when he came to Washington. What were your impressions of him? What kind of a man did you find him to be?
Charismatic, intelligent, strong, and also one who had a total lack of understanding of how an economy works, One who I wrote afterwards in a report to President Eisenhower, who was either a communist or totally naive about communism. And I quickly reached the conclusion it was the first.
What made you reach that conclusion?
What he did, his conduct in Cuba, his failing to go forward with regard to elections, his actions against those who had opposed him, the show trials, everything that he did. In other words, there was no question about where he stood.
Wasn't there a lot of anti-Castroism, though, before that became clear in America? A lot of people didn't want to meet him when he came at that time, a lot of political leaders, including the president. And you were sort of sent to feel him out and get an impression. Do you think that if he'd been treated differently, if he'd been accorded more honor and respect and his revolution praised instead of condemned or ignored, that he might have, if not become an ally, at least become a neutral?
Well, we hear that sort of nonsense about Nicaragua, that if only we had treated the new government, the Sandinistas, properly, that they would not have been tilting toward the Soviet Union and so forth and so on, and not have been communist. We hear the same thing with regard to the Soviet Union after World War II, that if only we had been more tolerant and not made them fearful of us, that then they would have come along and helped us build a new era of peace and prosperity and communication in Europe. And on Castro, that if only we had treated him properly, the same with Allende in Cuba, that we could have weaned him away from the communist support. And that isn't the real world. Because when you look at Castro's background, how he came to power and who supported him in that period, there's no question that Castro, in retrospect, was a dedicated communist operative from the beginning. And there's nothing that we could have done that would have changed that.
It's been written that you were one of the principal, it's been written that you were one of the principal proponents, if not indeed the creator, of the plan to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs during the last year of the Eisenhower administration. Is that true?
No, I was pretty busy at that time developing my campaign for 1960. There's no question that I supported the idea, along with Allen Dulles and others.
Were you aware of it from an early point?
I was aware of it from an early point. But as far as how it was to be done, how they were to be trained, how they were to be supported, I was not privy to that. I knew that we did have a program.
In your presidency, one of the most frustrating things was trying to get from the CIA the report of the CIA's internal report about the Bay of Pigs. Why did you want to have that?
Well, I felt it was very important to have that from a political standpoint, as well as from others as well, due to the fact that it seemed to me as the campaign was developing that that might become an issue. What I'm referring to is that as I saw the Bay of Pigs, start again. I felt it was important that with all the attacks we were going to be subjected to during the campaign, that we have a report as to what happened in the Bay of Pigs, and the other report that I wanted was on the bombing halt that was negotiated by President Johnson and the terms of that bombing halt. I felt we had to have all the facts with regard to how those particular events were developed.
I think we've come to the end of our hour. A little digression there.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Well, we'll see. Got the film of you with Castro, so we'll use that in the leaders section.
Yeah.
And we want to cover the Bay of Pigs for the 60.
then tomorrow, then we'll come around to, in view of all that, what?
The alert and the war
Of course,
itself.
but you have 74 summit where he he said that he didn't do it, didn't support the Israelis. He tried to restrain them and all that sort of thing. Do you want to get that in today or not? Well, we'll see.
Let's see.
See how it goes.
Frank,
Because that was in
starting
the...
a new subject that would require a light shot, or should we just come up to you on the tight shot?
Let's, no, just a tight shot.
Okay, we'll come on camera one. Stand by.
All right, here we go. 212.
13 years after your meeting with Khrushchev in the Kremlin, you were back as President of the United States for a meeting with Khrushchev's successor, Brezhnev. What were your impressions of Leonid Brezhnev as you walked into his office?
Well, naturally, I was thinking perhaps of how he differed from Khrushchev, because it was exactly the same office and the same table there, bare, no particular paintings or anything on the wall, nothing distinctive at all about it. But the men were quite different.
How did they differ?
Well, first let me say how they did not differ, because that's just as important. They were both dedicated communists. They were both ruthless. They were both very tough, as I've often pointed out. In communist countries, the weak never get to the top. Sometime you may elect in a free country a weak person, but in that jungle, it's dog eat dog, and only the fittest survive at the top. And so it was with Brezhnev. He was a tough, ruthless leader, just as was Khrushchev before him. There were differences, however. As I talked to Brezhnev, I found that while he was intelligent, he was not nearly as quick as Khrushchev. He was not nearly as unpredictable, although at times he could be pretty tricky as well. But he was a little more obvious about it than Khrushchev. He didn't have Khrushchev's scintillating sense of humor. He had a sense of humor, but Khrushchev could just move from one thing to another very fast. He dropped off proverbs practically every 2 or 3 minutes. He always had colorful phrases, which Brezhnev seldom had. I remember whenever Khrushchev in our talks would say that this or that or the other thing wouldn't be agreed to by the Soviet Union, and that wasn't going to happen. He said that isn't going to happen until a shrimp learns to whistle, or until you can see your ears without a mirror. You didn't hear Brezhnev talking that way. His humor was a little more obvious. I would say one other thing about the Khrushchev-Brezhnev difference is that while Khrushchev would at times be somewhat even vulgar, Brezhnev was crude at times, but not to the point of Khrushchev, not in an embarrassing way. He was just earthy, like Lyndon Johnson. I never thought of Lyndon Johnson as being a vulgar man. He never was, but he was an earthy man. And Brezhnev was very much like Johnson in that respect. And like him in another respect, very physical. He was a grabber. He'd always grab you when he wanted to make a point, either by the knee or by the arm. Incidentally, speaking of Johnson's tendency to do that, I recall President Eisenhower having a go with Jerry Persons, who succeeded Sherman Adams as chief of staff. Persons told me about this later. And he said that Johnson, President Eisenhower, had agreed to see the then majority leader of the Senate, Johnson. Johnson was coming into the Oval Office, and Eisenhower wasn't feeling too well that day, and he said, well, I'll agree to see him, Jerry, but on one condition. You stand between him and me at the desk, because I don't want him to grab my arm. My bursitis is kicking up. And he would have had to say that with Brezhnev, because Brezhnev was a grabber as well. All in all, another point I should make is that I think Brezhnev was more cautious than Khrushchev. Khrushchev was more imaginative, more creative. As a matter of fact, in a way, a more interesting person, but in a way also, in the short term, more dangerous. Maybe not in the long term. Brezhnev probably was just as dangerous because he was more cautious. But in the short term, Khrushchev could be counted upon to do something risky, something impulsive, like, for example, putting missiles into Cuba. I do not think that Brezhnev would have done that. That's the difference between the two and what they would do.
What, do you have an example of the difference between earthiness and crudity?
Well, as far as as Khrushchev's conversation was concerned, I've already indicated the confrontation we had when I first went into the office, and we compared the different kinds of manure, horse and pig for that matter. I don't think you would have seen Brezhnev do that.
The first night in Moscow, they gave a very grand banquet for you in the Kremlin. Do you remember that night?
Oh, very well. I had just met with Brezhnev in his office, and it had been a pretty testy go, although not nearly as testy as was the case with Khrushchev 13 years earlier. Brezhnev was very respectable. And incidentally, this brings me to another fundamental point between the difference between not only the men but their times. Khrushchev had a definite inferiority complex because his country was weaker. He knew that. By the time we met with Brezhnev, that inferiority was gone. He didn't have to constantly huff and puff and brag in a bellicose way as Khrushchev had. And that made for a much better, more, I would say, forthcoming discussion than would have been otherwise, although it was pretty tough at times. Well, we went into this beautiful room. It's in the Kremlin, and we have to remember the Kremlin was the religious center of the Tsarist Russia as well as the political center. In fact, it was primarily the religious center. And I recall we were sitting at this beautiful table, Brezhnev opposite me, and behind him was a magnificent mural, a 15th century mural of Christ and the apostles at the Last Supper. And Brezhnev noticed me looking at it, and he said, you know, that was the Politburo of those times. And I looked at it, and I said, well, that would seem to indicate that you, the General Secretary, and the Pope have a great deal in common. He laughed. He usually responded to humor very well. Incidentally, I was almost tempted to ask him who was the Judas of the day, but I thought better of it and didn't.
He might have responded by asking you how many battalions the Pope had.
That's right.
This first summit produced two major agreements, the anti-ballistic missile agreement and the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, the SALT Treaty. Mm-hmm. You have said that a leader shouldn't go to a summit unless he knows exactly what's going to come out of it. How much did you know that these agreements were going to come out of this summit, or how much negotiation actually was left to do face-to-face between you and Brezhnev?
Well, first I should point out that we had negotiated at a distance through our representatives long before that, and I knew what was going on every bit of the way. Henry Kissinger conducted those negotiations with great skill and great brilliance and great tenacity, and of course he had gone to the Soviet Union, had met for 4 days with Brezhnev, nailing down some of the final agreements. So the negotiations had taken place, but not face-to-face. When we got face-to-face, we assumed, or I assumed, that all we would do would be pretty much to put our signatures on the final product, which had already been prepared. But there were a few loose ends left to work out. Well, for example, with regard to the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the Soviet Union had an ABM system around Moscow. And we, of course, were just building one, or started to build one as a result of winning by only 1 vote in the Senate an ABM system for the United States that we were going to put around some of our Minutemen sites.
What is an ABM system?
An ABM means an anti-ballistic missiles. It will shoot down incoming missiles. And they wanted to protect Moscow, which is their command center from which they order strikes from around the whole world. In any event, the critical question there was how close or how far away the missiles should be, the ABM system, I should say, should be from Moscow. And it had been a point of contention because we wanted it as far away from Moscow as possible. But they wanted it closer in. And so under the circumstances then, as we were talking, Brezhnev said to me, well, it is our understanding that what we have agreed to is that these missiles be, our ABM system be 1,200 kilometers from Moscow. And I knew that wasn't right, and I said 1,500. He said, no, I thought it was 1,200, and I said 1,500. He says, all right, it's 1,200. All right, it's 1,500. No, I'm sorry. Let's start again. He said, it's our understanding that we are to put our ABM system 1,200 miles from Moscow. And I said, no, that's not correct. What I understand we've agreed to is 1,500 miles. He said, why 1,500 miles? Do you want us to put it in the Urals? And I said, no, it's my understanding 1,500 miles. And then he just dropped it like that. Okay, 1,500 is all right. And I remember Henry Kissinger passed me a little note. He said this whole summit was worth that one interchange. In any event, Brezhnev was trying, of course, to slip a fast one by us, but thanks to Kissinger's good preparation and my being briefed fairly well on it, we were able to say no. We hardlined it, and he took the 1,500.
There was another.
And there was another interplay, incidentally, with regard to the offensive weapons. You understand the ABM treaty, the defensive weapons was one part of it. That became a treaty, and that was permanent. And on the other hand, the offensive limitation was a temporary one. It was to be for 5 years. That is what I had understood would be the agreement that the Russians had worked out with Kissinger at the second level. And when we came to that discussion, Brezhnev all of a sudden said, why don't we make it 10 years? And Kissinger immediately stepped into the conversation. He said, look, he said, we only agreed to 5 years. We both did, because you only wanted 18 months. And now we have 5 years. The reason, incidentally, we didn't want to go to 10 years was that we couldn't be in a position of in effect, freezing ourselves into any position that would be inferior to the Russians. In 5 years, we had to determine whether we were going to get control on their offensive weapons, which were moving up much faster than ours.
Aren't we inferior to them now?
In land-based missiles, yes. Not overall. Overall, we're ahead in the sea, we're ahead in the air, but the land-based missiles are the heaviest, they're the most accurate, they're the most decisive. They're frankly the key to any nuclear strategy.
Why do they?
They're the only ones that have a first strike capability.
Why do they adopt this kind of negotiating tactics? Because if something had been agreed on beforehand, and in a negotiation, the difference between 1,200 and 1,500 were transposed, couldn't you come back and say, even if you had agreed to something unexpectedly, couldn't you come back and say that in all the negotiations beforehand, this was simply a misspeaking? Or does the president have the power to actually make an irreversible commitment in a negotiation like that one-on-one?
Oh, certainly the president has the power, without any question.
Could you not come back and say,
And so did he have the power. I think the reason they did that was that they were simply testing me. They were trying to see how badly I wanted to deal. They had probably tried it out on Kissinger earlier, and he said, well, no, I can't, because I cannot without consulting the president. He was always very good at doing that. And so they made a run at me, basically an appeal to the highest court. And when they found that I took exactly the same line, they backed down. They probe every place they can, and as Lenin used to say, he said, probe with bayonets. He said, if you find mush, proceed. If you find steel, withdraw. And in this case, they found steel, so they withdrew.
Another trip to a Dacha was planned as part of the summit activities. Was it the same one that Khrushchev had taken you to?
Exactly the same one, the same river, everything. We went at a different time of day, however. We had just finished a very long day of negotiations, and we were scheduled to go out there a little later that night for dinner. And as we finished our discussions, Brezhnev grabbed me by the arm as we went into the elevator, and he says, look, he says, I want you to see the Moscow countryside in the daytime, because he knew, of course, that we had gone out the previous time to spend the night. And so we got into his limousine. The Secret Service were practically petrified because they weren't with us, and we took off at about 100 a mile clip down the middle of the Moscow roads, with all of the people, of course, the other people in the private cars off to the side, and we went out to the Dacha. When we got there, he showed me around, as I, of course, recalled exactly how it looked before, and it was very interesting. And they had me stay, incidentally, in the same bedroom. It's an interesting thing. The Chinese and the Russians are very different, but they tend to go with the same ploy with regard to physical arrangements. For example, in 1972, I stayed in a fine guest house in Peking. When I came back in 1976, they had me in exactly the same guest house, and Mrs. Nixon and I came back. In this case, we went there in 1972, and we had exactly the same dacha that we had had for 13 years before. And the same was true, incidentally, with regard to our Kremlin suite, the magnificent Kremlin suite, which Brezhnev had shown me as we came in 1972, the one that was made available to us then, exactly the same one, right down to the caviar and the cucumbers on the dining room table that we had in 1972. It was there in 1974.
Were the hidden microphones the same?
Well, as far as the microphones are concerned, we always assumed that they were there. And incidentally, we assumed that they were in China. I had a practice in that time, in 72, 73, 74, of dictating into my Sony dictator my recollections at the end of a day. In order to do that, I turned on what we call a scrambler, and it makes a lot of noise and so forth, which scrambles it so that the microphones, which are usually, we assume, up in the ceiling or perhaps in the phone or something like that, couldn't pick it up. Consequently, when my secretary years later had to transcribe some of that, it was a little difficult to hear it because of the scrambler. If you have any doubt about it, however, one of the White House secretaries who was on that trip told me of a very amusing incident thereafter. She just happened to casually, as she went in one day for lunch and saw all the cucumbers and the other fine things that they served around there, said, you know, gee, I'd really wish I could get an apple. And about 10 minutes later, in walked a maid very noiselessly and put a whole basket of apples right on the table for her.
Wasn't there a story about Kissinger wanting to get Xeroxed copies of something?
Yes, well, this Kissinger's meeting with Gromyko, and he told me about this later with great glee, because Henry has a very good sense of humor. He's a very serious negotiator, but he's got a sharp sense of humor, and he uses it effectively. And he said he and Gromyko were talking, and Gromyko, when he saw this piece of paper that they were discussing that Henry had brought along, he said he'd like to have copies. And so Henry took the piece of paper and held it up to the chandelier and said, 6 copies, please.
At this first Moscow summit as president, just as Khrushchev had taken you out on the Moscow River for a boat ride, didn't Brezhnev do the same thing?
Yes, in this case, he took me, however, in a hydrophil. That was the new kind of boat that they had, and he was very, very proud of it. He kept pointing to the thermometer. He was very proud of it. He kept pointing to the speedometer, which would show us going at around 60 to 75 kilometers an hour, which I mean about 40 knots, which is real fast. You know, it gets up above the water and just sails right along. I was glad there were no sunken logs rising to the surface at that point. And
were there any swimmers that time?
This time, no ploy like that, because there had been no discussion of captive peoples. Oh, we had one little interesting interchange. I recall I asked him about the Moscow River because I had remembered the swimmers from before, and I said, did he ever swim? He says, oh, no. He says, I prefer to swim down on the Black Sea. The water is much warmer. Here, it's much colder, and it gets you right here, and he pointed to his groin. He pointed to his groin.
At the, in your meetings with Khrushchev at the Dacha, he gave you that eerie nuclear workover over luncheon. Were you treated any better by Brezhnev and his comrades in 1972?
Only in the sense that we were treated very, very toughly, but privately. See, the Khrushchev treatment was rather interesting because the wives were there, Mrs. Nixon and Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Brezhnev and so forth and so on. And they sat there as spectators, eyes agog and so forth and so on, as anybody would. In this case, however, we were going up to dinner. The dinner was to be held later, and this we were preparing to go up to dinner. And what happened was that before dinner, Brezhnev suggested that we should have a little talk. So we went into a room, and here I was confronted on the other side of the table with Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny being the president of the Soviet Union, at least insofar as his title was concerned. And Kissinger, of course, was on our side and one of his associates. And then for 3.5 hours, they just pummeled me on Vietnam. One would talk, and then another would talk, and then another would take up the cudgels. And when either Brezhnev or Podgorny had the floor, Brezhnev, when either, let me start again. One would talk and then the other and so forth. I'll take that sequence again. They just pummeled me with arguments. First one would talk, and then another would talk, and then another one. And sometimes all of them talked at once. It just reminded me of the scrambler we had back in the hotel room, or I should say in the room at the Kremlin, in our apartment there. And on occasion, when Podgorny had the floor, or when Kosygin had the floor, Brezhnev would get up and pace the floor. That was something he did quite often. He'd get up and pace the floor. Like Douglas MacArthur used to pace the floor on occasion when he got very, involved in a subject. Matter of fact, Brezhnev used to tell Kissinger on occasion, he said, every time I stand up, I make another concession. That was a slight overstatement, incidentally, but he made good use of it. But the whole thrust of it was to take me on there on the issue of Vietnam. So you have to lay the groundwork there. We went to Moscow 3 weeks after bombing and mining the Hanoi-Haiphong complex. And we thought when that decision was made that there was a very good chance that we would never go at all. In fact, right after the decision was made, Henry said there was only a 10% chance that they would not call off the summit. The next day he raised it to 20, and the following day to 30, and then we were all, frankly, relieved and somewhat surprised that they finally raised no objection at all, and we went. But in any event, here they were getting in their licks on Vietnam. And one point that was made during the course of the conversation, I remember it was Podgorny, who is the nominal president of the Soviet Union, was saying, we don't understand, and international opinion does not understand how you could possibly support an unelected leader of South Vietnam. And I said, who elected the leader of North Vietnam? He said, all the people. I says, go ahead. But the point was made. And then on another occasion, when Kosygin had taken it up, he's a little bit more subtle than either Brezhnev than Podgorny. Certainly the most intelligent overall of the three. But he made the point, he said, in the event that the United States continues to handle the Vietnam issue from a position of so-called strength, he said, you must be aware of the fact that the time may come when the North Vietnamese will no longer refuse to ask some of their allies and friends to assist them. Well, I knew that had gone too far, and I said, that threat doesn't frighten me a bit, but go ahead and make it. And then he backed down and said, well, I didn't intend it as a threat. I was simply stating what the facts might be. Well, after this had gone on for about an hour, and I was just listening and not reacting, I decided we ought to break the momentum just a little bit. And they were all smoking. I think they were all smoking, at least. And they used to always offer their cigarettes to me. And this time I'd come prepared. I had a package of something called cigarillos. I don't happen to smoke cigarillos with me. I don't smoke them either, but I pulled them out. They look like cigarettes, cigar tobacco, and offered them around. Well, that stopped the conversation because they didn't want them. They liked their own cigarettes. And so they thanked me profusely and didn't take them, but at least it broke the momentum of the conversation. But then they took it up again.
What was there any result?
Well, the result was that I finally answered, and that ended the meeting. And the answer was very tough. I said, now look, you've talked about the fact that the United States is responsible for deaths in Vietnam and that sort of thing. You've talked about your standing by your allies. Let me say we're going to stand by ours. But let's understand one thing. I said, a great American general, General Sherman, once said that war is hell. And I said, nobody knows better than you, the people of the Soviet Union, that war is hell after what you went through in World War I and World War II. But let me tell you the hell that you have been responsible for in South Vietnam. 20,000 civilians have already been killed since that offensive was launched on May the 8th. 20,000 civilians killed primarily by guns and tanks furnished by the Soviet Union. I said, now we're not going to tolerate that. Let's understand that right at the beginning. Then we went up to have dinner. That stopped the conversation.
Well, the dinner must have been uncomfortable.
On the contrary, it's just like Khrushchev. He was like Khrushchev in this way. They moved from a period of confrontation and negotiation to one of belligerence to total Russian hospitality. They had the very finest, as you could imagine, caviar and all the other fine Russian dishes, wines and so forth. We joked a little about Kissinger being there. Kissinger, incidentally, does not drink. Well, he just barely tastes it. Like any good diplomat, he knows that isn't very smart. And so I made my usual joke, well, let's be sure that we give Henry plenty of vodka so that, and Gromyko plenty as well, so that they can work out the negotiations, and they'd all laugh at that.
Is that where you had the discussion about the relative merits of different kinds of dictation techniques?
Well, there was a lot of conversation at the dinner, just to give you an idea of the temper and so forth and so on. On rather personal habits and so forth, and I asked Brezhnev about whether he used the dictaphone. Now, as a matter of fact, the reason I asked him was that I was hoping I might be able to give him one as a minor state gift. We had already agreed to give him another luxury car for his collection of luxury automobiles. He says, oh, no. He says, I never want to use a dictaphone machine. He said, I don't like to dictate into an impersonal machine. And then with a little sort of a wink, he said, I'd much rather dictate to a pretty girl. And he said, did you know when you wake up in the middle of the night and want to make a note, it's always very useful to have somebody there in the room to give it to.
What do you think they expected to accomplish from this triple teaming of you on the subject of Vietnam? They must have known that you were not going to cave under that kind of pressure. What do you think they wanted to say or achieve?
Well, first they were making a record. They were making a record for themselves and among themselves, each proving that he was tough. They were making a record, and this would, of course, they knew, get back to their hierarchy, for their hierarchy, that they were standing by their ally. They were making a record also for the North Vietnamese. I think that was the main purpose. I do not think that they had any illusions that they were going to change me, because they, after what I had done, ordering 3 weeks before the summit, knowing it would risk the summit, the bombing and mining of Haiphong, I think they were totally aware that no rhetoric, warm or soft, was going to change me.
What do you think they thought of you?
I think they, whether they liked or disliked is irrelevant. That's again one of the problems we have in dealing with the Soviets. We're so obsessed, we Americans, with the idea, does he like me? Am I handling myself in a way that will give him a warmer feeling toward me? And all that is it's nonsense in dealing with these people. These people are total materialists. It isn't whether they like you or not, it's whether they respect you. And I don't mean by that you go out and spit in their eye and swear at them and embarrass them and the rest. But in the final analysis, their decisions will be made coldly and objectively, depending upon whether they respect their adversaries. They'll push you as far as they can, but no further. And I think they felt that I couldn't be pushed around, but also I think they respected the fact that after our long negotiations leading up to the first summit, negotiations on Berlin, which were successful, negotiations where we got them to take their missiles or their missile submarine base out of Cuba and Cienfuegos, negotiations that kept them out of intervening in the war between Syria and Jordan on the side of Syria in 1970, and negotiations which got them to participate with us in bringing a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. I think in view of that background, they felt, well, he is strong and tough, but reasonable. And so having recognized that they weren't going to get something for nothing, they recognized that they had to give something in order to get something. And that was the basis for what I think were very successful negotiations, right for us and right for them as properly implemented.
H.R. Haldeman has written about talking to you about what you both called the Madman Theory, which you applied vis-a-vis the North Vietnamese particularly, that you as an inveterate anti-communist couldn't be depended upon not to do something extreme if provoked, and therefore that was supposed to get them to give concessions at the negotiations. Was that applied vis-a-vis the Soviets? Did they think that with your finger on the button you just might do something?
Well, apart from what Bob Haldeman has said, certainly that was Henry Kissinger's view. Kissinger felt that it was very important, not, of course, to think like a madman, but on occasion to give the impression to a potential adversary that you might engage in very tough action, and always to leave that impression. And above all, never to indicate, and Eisenhower used to say this, don't ever indicate to your potential adversary what you won't do. Don't say, look, I'm not going to put in forces, I'm not going to do this, you can count on me to do this and that and the other thing. Leave them always a little uncertain, that if they push you too far, you're willing to take great risks. And my May 8th decision, my bombing in December, the bombing of December after the elections of 1972, while those were very difficult decisions politically, they were effective in bringing the war to Vietnam to an end, but also they were effective in establishing credibility with the Russians and any other nation that might want to test us in the international area.
Did you make any special arrangements for the dinner you gave for Brezhnev at the American embassy?
Not particularly special. I didn't think it was particularly special because, you know, we had a usual dinner. Well, we flew in beef from Kansas City, as I recall, and we had some California wines and that sort of thing, the usual thing, just as we had in China. We were making very sure we did exactly the same things we did for the Russians that we'd done for the Chinese. But when the dessert came around, it was one of my favorite, it was baked Alaska. And Brezhnev brightened up and he says, oh, the Americans are really miracle workers. They've learned how to set ice cream on fire. Now, I just wondered if probably they don't make baked Alaska too, because they use a lot of flaming dishes, but it was a nice compliment in any event, and our chef, Dela Cruz, was just overwhelmed by it.
From Moscow, you went on to Kiev. What were your impressions of Kiev?
Well, Kiev, of course, is in the Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have always had a history of not being pro-Russian. As a matter of fact, when the German armies moved into the Ukraine, and shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II, the Ukrainians welcomed them with flowers and open arms and so forth, and only because of the repression, which was very stupid, the viciousness in many cases of the Nazi soldiers, did they turn against the Germans, because they wanted to be liberated from the Russians, the communists particularly. But in the Ukraine, I must say Kiev was very different from Moscow. In Moscow, as we drove through the streets, there were crowds, but they were kept 3 blocks away. And the crowds were very unresponsive. They seemed to be fearful to come close at all. But every time you get away from the center of the Soviet Union, the political center, Moscow. It's a lot more free, to use that term in the broadest sense, in Leningrad, in Siberia, and certainly in the Ukraine. I remember in one of the streets he went through there were balconied apartments, and people, women and children and so forth, were leaning out of the balconies, waving their handkerchiefs and scarves and that sort of thing. There was really an emotional welcome.
Wasn't there a point when you wondered whether you were ever going to get out of Moscow?
Well, that of course was perhaps the most memorable part of the visit to the Ukraine, was just getting there. We went out to the airport. Brezhnev did not go on that trip because he was the general secretary, but only the political leaders were going. So Kosygin and Podgorny, the president, were accompanying me. And we got into the plane, and we were waiting for the takeoff, and there was a little bit of a wait, and Kissinger and Haldeman and I were sitting going over schedules. And all of a sudden, back into our compartment, walked Kosygin with Brezhnev, with the most woe-begone looking Soviet general, B-ribbon and so forth, I've ever seen. He was the chief of Soviet civil aviation, as I learned later. And Kosygin said to me, and Podgorny said to me, he says, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but we've got some engine trouble. And they introduced the general to me, and they said, what do you want us to do to him? And I said, promote him. And they said, what? And I said, promote him. I said, promote him for finding the trouble on the ground rather than waiting until we got into the air. Incidentally, we'd had a similar situation, now that you mention it, with Khrushchev. We went in that Moscow boat trip that we saw a film of here earlier. We were going down the river, and the pilot of the boat ran into a sandbar. And Khrushchev was furious. He gave that poor devil a look that I know must have practically frozen him, and he's probably out digging salt in Siberia if he's even living today. But in any event, I tried to play it down by pointing up something that had happened to me just a month before. I said, well, Mr. Chairman, don't be concerned about that. I said, this can happen. I said, I have a very good friend that happened to Miss Bibi Rebozo, who's a very good boatman, and he ran into a sandbar down on the Keys of Florida just recently, so it can happen to anybody. Khrushchev didn't smile one bit. He just made a snarly look at this other fellow. But in any event, we saved the life of the general and probably his promotion on that plane.
What was Kosygin like?
Kosygin, very intellectual. He was not crude at all, highly sophisticated. One who also understood business very well. He was the businessman of the group. He understood economics extremely well. I think Macmillan once told me that Kosygin was one who could be the chairman of a major
ICI.
That?
I think didn't he say ICI?
Yes.
Imperial Chemical Industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was Macmillan who once told me, they said Kosygin could be the chairman of one of their big chemical industry complexes or something of that sort. He was a very cold fish in that respect. And also, I sensed that he, deep down, was at times even more Russian than communist, although a dedicated communist. I remember I sat with him, between him and Podgorny, as a matter of fact, when they took us to the Bolshoi, and we saw Swan Lake. And I was remarking to him what a beautiful building that Bolshoi was. And I found that this is one thing, incidentally, we totally agreed on. He compared it to the Canadian Center, where he had seen some ballet when he had visited Canada, a great modern building, modern like the Kennedy Center, and also like the Lincoln Center here in New York. And he said he much preferred the Bolshoi to it. And he also remarked that as far as the Swan Lake was concerned, which he had seen many times, and I had as well, that the section he liked the best was the dance of the four swans in the second act. But it was a little byplay. It doesn't tell us any more than that he liked ballet, as I did, and Tchaikovsky, as I did. but also that he didn't like modern architecture, and I didn't either. So we had some agreement.
Didn't he tell you there a story about his meeting with Castro?
No, the meeting with Castro, he didn't tell that. He did tell me that story, but not there. That occurred, as a matter of fact, on the flight to Kiev on the airplane. And it's a fascinating story, I thought. He had seen Castro in 1967. No, wait a minute. Yes, he had seen Castro, he said in 1967, so it must have been then. And they had gone swimming in Havana at the great Varadero Beach, which is a long, one of the great beaches of the world, where you have to go out a long, long way before the water gets over your head. And he said he and Castro walked out through the waves, waded out until finally they were able to float, and the water was over their heads. And Castro remarked to him, he says, well, he said, we are now in international waters. And Kosygin replied, that's okay. He said, I know Johnson, and he's not going to do anything against me.
At the summit in 1972, did Brezhnev say anything about the Chinese, and did he refer to your trip to China, which had been just 3 or 4 months earlier?
Minimally. Not particularly surprisingly, however. It was in 1973 when he hit the hardest on the China initiative. But that's another story that we may get to when we get to that particular summit. But in 1972, he said very little. For example, he did mention it in that very testy meeting that we had at the Dacha, when he said that he made the point that what we were trying to do in terms of our offensive and in terms of our supporting the Vietnamese was, of course, to embarrass them on their China policy. Embarrass, well, forget that.
Do you think, although Brezhnev didn't mention China, do you think it was ever not on his mind for a minute?
Oh, absolutely. The reason he didn't mention it was on his mind very much. But he wasn't about to show any concern about it, having in mind the fact that we had just been to China in February. The only one passing comment, which was a theme that Khrushchev had used 13 years before, and which Brezhnev used again in 73 and again in 74, was a comment to the effect, just in passing, that we Europeans, as he put it, referring to us as Europeans as well, and the Russian Europeans, we Europeans are very different from the Chinese, the Asiatics.
Did he make any references to the upcoming presidential election or to Senator McGovern?
No, not with regard to McGovern, but he made several references with regard to his hope that I would be reelected. He toasted my reelection. There was no question, first, that he believed I was going to be reelected. They follow the American polls closer than we do, and through Ambassador Dobrynin, who is perhaps the ablest ambassador who's been in Washington for the last 25 years, they get a very good rundown of what's happening in American politics. Let me say again, I don't mean that when he toasted me as the next president and he hoped that I would be reelected and all that sort of thing, I don't mean that he was doing that in any sentiment. He didn't do that because he liked me. He was saying that because he thought objectively that I was probably going to win, that he was going to have to deal with me, and consequently, recognizing what he could do nothing about, he was going to make the best of it.
In his heart of hearts, do you think he would have preferred McGovern, or is there any truth to or validity to the theory that the Soviets prefer a dependable, conservative, anti-communist president to President Carter, presumably being the case in point, to a more sympathetic but erratic and undependable liberal?
That's a very close question. I know both of those theories. I think that at that time, in the year 1972, that Brezhnev did want a dependable president, one who could deliver on whatever deals were made, one that could carry the country with him. I think, on the other hand, there are times when the Soviet would welcome having a president who was naive, or at least they considered to be naive, one that they could take liberties with, and so forth. The difficulty with the latter, however, is that they know that the American political scene is a volatile one. It's a fast-changing one. And they know that the country may be dovish today and become very hawkish tomorrow. So I think that, generally speaking, the pragmatic men in the Kremlin prefer leaders in the United States who are strong, not belligerent, but strong, pragmatic as they are, and also ones that can carry the country with them. At least that's my observation, but it could be wrong.
What do you feel was the principal accomplishment of